Good afternoon and welcome to Capital Account. I'm Lauren Lister here in Washington, D.C. Here are your headlines for Wednesday, May 23rd, 2012. As an informal summit of European leaders has observers worried about a Greek exit and seeking signs to show where the eurozone is headed, look at the market. German 30-year bunds tumbled below 2% for the first time ever. Meanwhile, for the privilege of lending your money to the German government for 2 years, you can get paid a stunning, wait for it, 0%. Now, these rates aren't suppressed by QE or ZIRP like in the U.S., so we'll talk about what this indicator says about the fear that is building. And according to media reports, the guessing game is underway for who will replace Timothy Geithner as US Treasury Secretary. Now, you may be asking, why would anyone want to try to tackle trillion-dollar budget deficits and a tax overhaul for a salary 115 times less than their Wall Street buddies like Jamie Dimon? Well, we're wondering that too, so we'll ask a former Treasury official if this is a public service or a one-way ticket to a massive private sector payoff. Also, in the wake of Facebook's IPO flop, we see small investors suing, regulators subpoenaing, and U.S. lawmakers supposedly searching for answers. Now, retail investors, for one, are asking if they were fleeced. But we'll show you how this could have all been avoided if they just watched Capital Account. Let's get to today's show. Step back and take a look at the bigger picture than the headlines that I just went over. So America once prided itself on being the beacon of freedom and the land of opportunity. We saw immigrants flock here by the millions from countries all over the world. And it wasn't just America's physical dimensions, its untapped resources, its rich landscape, but also its unique commitment to individual liberty and the rule of law that made it such a tempting destination for those looking to escape the feudal architecture of the old world. Now, it would be overly simplistic to pick a specific date after which things began to change for the worse in this country. The Spanish-American War, the establishment of the Federal Reserve, the establishment of a permanent military architecture after World War II, the end of Bretton Woods, the deregulation of the financial sector, the Patriot Act. The list goes on and on. You can choose what you like best. What is clear, though, is that a lot of Americans, for them, the future looks less promising than the past. And unless you work in one of America's highly subsidized industries, such as Wall Street or defense, you're stressed. But if you're one of the many maybe working in these two anointed industries, things perhaps have never looked so good. Now, there was a time when Wall Street grew earnings and profits off the back of real economic growth. And the purpose of banking was to finance investment and aid in the movement of capital from savers to investors. The end result was real economic growth. Today, the financial services industry resembles more like a giant parasite sucking the lifeblood of capital out of the economy. It derives its profits by doing exactly the opposite of what it was tasked to do, by siphoning off capital from savers and moving it into the trading accounts of speculators and crony executives at banks who pay themselves disgustingly outrageous bonuses, all under the guise of being systemically important. So they say, or systemically dangerous, as more of our guests say. Now, Americans aren't stupid. They know they're being fleeced. They see images like that of police pepper spraying defenseless women, and this is all while building barricades around the ivory towers of Wall Street bankers who continue to plunder the wealth of a generation of Americans unencumbered. And in Europe, of course, you see Greeks revolting against the same kind of plundering of their country. Now, this has observers looking to meetings of European leaders like the ones going on today for signs of where this is going next. Here to talk about it with us is Paul Craig Roberts. He's an economist and also former Assistant Secretary of the US Treasury. That was under Ronald Reagan. First, Dr. Roberts, thanks for being on the show. Welcome back to Capital Account.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Now, let's start our discussion with I gave a long sermon on Wall Street. Let's talk about who regulates it. Because you used to work at the Treasury, and now people are starting to wonder and think about who's going to be the next Treasury Secretary, because Timothy Geithner has made it clear that it's not going to be him. We know Timothy Geithner's background. We know that he was at the New York Fed before the Treasury. We know he has ties to Wall Street. Do you think that over the years, this position has gone from being a public servant to a lobbyist for Wall Street of sorts?
Yes, of course, right. The Treasury and the financial regulatory agencies have belonged to Goldman Sachs since the Clinton administration.
Well, let's go back and talk about that, because the Clinton administration was when some very key things happened in terms of financial deregulation. You've written about the costs of that deregulation to society. What would you say the main costs are?
Well, the main cost is the financial industry in the United States no longer serves a useful social purpose. It's just a gambling casino that serves the purpose of the people running it, and at the expense of society, because they pass on their losses to the average person who really not had an income gain in 20 years. So the cost is that they have totally privatized profits to the extent that they don't even pay income taxes. So there's the banks themselves. But all their losses are dumped onto the taxpayer. So this is a net loss to society. The American financial system is a net drain on society. If we didn't have it, we would be better off, by far, by trillions of dollars better off. So it doesn't perform a useful social function.
And if you had to pinpoint any acts of deregulation, any bills that were signed or that were repealed, what would they be that have created this situation?
Yes, well, you know, Glass-Steagall, which now lets them gamble with depositors' deposits, depositors' money. The removal of position limits on speculation, which now lets these huge financial institutions dominate commodity markets and drive up prices of fuel or food. And also, they now are able to leverage their little bit of equity to extreme lengths in order to maximize the return on equity. You see, the higher the return on equity, the way you get it is to have tremendous debt. So you take a little bit of equity and you leverage it dramatically, and then your return on earnings go way up. The only trouble is, if you make a wrong bet, then you dump all the losses on society. So it's these are the main things. The fact that they.
So you mentioned the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and that happened under President Bill Clinton. And, you know, he also did another thing, which was sign the Commodities Future Modernization Act, which made it so that derivatives really couldn't be regulated. So let's talk about who deregulation has paid off for, not just Wall Street, but these politicians and officials, because Matt Knoller at Naked Capitalism wrote a really good post about the speaking fees from banks that President Bill Clinton received in the decade after he left the presidency. And you have banks paying him $150,000 for a 1-hour speech. This has amounted to $8 to $10 million for that decade. Or no, excuse me, $8 to $10 million a year for that decade. Dr. Roberts, what in the world are these banks paying him $150,000 an hour to say? Like, what's the point?
They're paying him for the deregulation, and Geithner will be paid as well. He'll get some huge job, and you see, it's more than a revolving door, because now, even if you have a big job, for example, Paulson was a CEO of Goldman Sachs. You come into the Treasury in order to get more contacts, better contacts, and not just here, but all over the world, so that Goldman Sachs' empire can expand. And when you leave, you're even more valuable. So it's there's no service, there's no public service involved anymore. It's all whose interests can I best serve to have this payoff for me? And
so,
of course,
could that pay off your service in the Treasury? Could it pay off unless you are still a member in the political class and go along with what Wall Street wants or advance their interests? Is that necessary in order to secure these speaking fees?
That's how it works, right?
When did this change? Because you said that you don't think it's always been this way. I'm just curious because you were at Treasury in '81, I believe. What changed?
Well, what changed was the deregulation, because this let them realize that there was no constraints left on them, that there was no reason they had to behave ethically or properly in any way, because all the constraints are gone. They essentially are now also part of the of Washington's effort to protect its worldwide economic interests. So they help Washington put pressure on the euro. They help Washington short gold and silver to protect the dollar. The banks or Wall Street, the big banks, are now just part of the federal government's self-protective mechanism. And so, in effect, they're part of the government. And that's why they don't get prosecuted for their crimes. If you look at all the crimes associated with the financial crisis, nothing has happened to anybody. And this is what's so strange and so unprecedented. And in my opinion, it's because the banks now serve as adjuncts to Washington and the political class.
And the political class serves as lobbyists for the banks. Just to give our audience a little bit more context, too, of former Treasury secretaries, because I looked into this. So Robert Rubin, who was also under Bill Clinton, he went on to work at Citigroup, made $126 million during his time there, reportedly. And Larry Summers, who has been in and out of public service and an academic, he's raked in millions, okay? When I looked back at what he reported for 2008, $2.7 million that year in, what do you know, speaking fees, a lot of them from the big banks, $5 million from a hedge fund. So there's really seems to be the payoff for deregulation that just isn't there for regulation. Dr. Roberts, when we get back, I want to talk about all of this, looking at Europe, which is switching gears, but still some of these issues there. It looked like you wanted to say a finishing thought. You have a couple seconds if you wanted to.
Well, didn't Rubin come into the Treasury from Goldman Sachs, right?
He did.
Wasn't he the chairman at Goldman Sachs? So he comes from Goldman Sachs to the Treasury and goes back to Citibank.
Yeah, it's the revolving door. We know that. The speaking fees were really the alarming thing to me. Thank you. We will be back with more with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, economist and former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Reagan. Still ahead, despite calls from columnists and pundits, Jamie Dimon remains on the board of the New York Fed, but not for long if two senators can help it. We'll give you our 3 cents on a bill targeting Federal Reserve conflicts. But first, your closing market numbers.
Drives the world.
The fear-mongering used by politicians.
Who makes decisions?
Considerable breakthrough has already been made.
Who can you trust?
No one who is imbued with a global missionary zeal.
Where are we heading?
State-controlled capitalism is called fascism.
When nobody dares to ask, we do. RT, question more.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Tom Hartman. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Welcome to the Alona Show, where you'll get the real headlines with none of the mercy. The problem with the mainstream media today is that they're completely disconnected from the viewers and from what actually matters to those viewers. And so that's why young people just don't watch TV anymore. If they want news, they go online and read it. But we're trying to take those stories that people actually care about and transfer them back to TV.
right, welcome back. So we've been talking to Paul Craig Roberts about some conflicts of interest, you could say, about the fine men that have served the United States as US Treasury Secretary and then go on to make millions, a lot more than they make as Treasury Secretary, when they go serve Wall Street or give a speech to Wall Street banks. Now, despite all this, it's just one example. We haven't seen people in the U.S. get angry to the extent that we've seen it in Europe, where they have a debt crisis that maybe you could argue has affected them a lot more close to their lives, especially in the situation of Greece, where they've seen immense cuts to the public. Let's talk about it, because right now eurozone leaders are meeting to talk about it. A lot of people are wondering if they're talking Greece exit contingency plans or euro bonds. We don't know. But here to talk about what really is going on in Europe as he sees it is Paul Craig Roberts, economist and former Assistant Secretary of the US Treasury under Reagan. So kind of segueing from our last conversation, Dr. Roberts, why do you think it is that we have not seen the kind of unrest in the United States that we have seen in Europe in response to economic strife and turmoil?
Because the costs have not been pushed on to the American public anywhere near the extent that they've been pushed on to the European public. You see the bailout of the banks here. There's a lot of talk about, oh, we'll have to cut Social Security, Medicare, and all that sort of thing, but they haven't really done it. But in Europe, they have gone in. You know, Greece, they've cut the pensions, they've cut all kinds of social services, employment. People are actually feeling the consequences of paying for the mistake of the private banks who overinvested in sovereign debt. And that hasn't happened yet here. And so that's the real reason that the Greeks are in the streets with Molotov cocktails, throwing them at the police, and people here are sort of insouciant as to the gathering storm.
Do you think, just to follow up on that briefly, if there were cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security of any significant amount, we would see this in the United States?
Well, that affects mainly the the older people who have a hard time rioting, but in the sense that it comes back to their children, that, you know, mom and dad can't exist independently anymore, and we don't have anything really to spare, then yes, in that sense, it filters down to the younger set. So I think this type of dissatisfaction can certainly rise sharply in the United States. But that's only if they actually follow through this talk. And you see, as long as the Federal Reserve can simply purchase the debt, monetize the debt, which is something the Greek central bank can't do, or the Spanish, or the Italian. And it's something under the charter that the European central bank can't do. So the big difference is that in the United States, the Federal Reserve can act as creditor to Washington and purchase its debt. But in Europe, the central bank, there's no way for it to do that. And so the pain comes to the people directly and much quicker.
And let's talk about some of the reaction by the financial markets to this, because you see borrowing costs for Germany, they've dropped to 0% in the case of some of those bonds, the 2-year bonds that we talked about earlier. Meanwhile, the government of Greece is effectively shut out of the bond market and has to rely on direct funding from the IMF, from the Troika, making it, I guess you could call it, a quasi-protectorate. This isn't unique to Greece either. I mean, you could see this happening in other countries that are severely indebted, in Spain or in Italy. So do you think the markets are just going to continue to keep the pressure on these countries until the system breaks? Or do you think the European federalists will succeed in keeping the union together by force?
Well, I think that'll be up to Germany. And I don't think Germany's quite decided. You see, the reason the German bonds now don't pay anything is it's a safe place to be, because the German economy is the strongest in Europe. They don't trust banks. People are afraid to have the money in the bank because they don't know if the bank has too much Greek debt. And so there's no place else to put it. So the German bonds, they say, is safe. And it's also coming here, and they mistakenly think that that this is a safe haven, the United States. So they buy treasuries, and the treasuries interest rate goes close to zero, and they get into dollars. But of course, the problem here, the debt problem, is probably even greater than Europe, and the banks are probably in an even worse situation. So the whole notion that there are any safe havens at all is a very strange one.
Well, before we go, we just have a minute, but it sounds like you think that Europe has kind of kept some scrutiny away from the U.S. dollar. What do you think is in store for the U.S. dollar?
Well, I think once the European situation is over, the focus will turn to the dollar. And then it will be, the outcome will depend on also the formation of the BRIC Bank by Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa. If they actually form this bank and use it for their own trade and financing, then this sort of cuts into the role of the dollar as reserve currency. And so the whole thing starts heading for the skids. And if the dollar loses its reserve currency role or finds it's severely modified, then the United States will experience all kinds of problems.
Obviously, and it sounds like maybe Europe is helping out the U.S. and the U.S. dollar, and having that situation under control might have unintended consequences that whoever's the next Treasury Secretary, since we've been talking about him or her, won't be too happy to see on their watch. Thank you so much for being on the show. That was Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, economist, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury under Ronald Reagan. All right, let's wrap up with loose change. Dimitri, Shannon, we all know that it is messed up that Jamie Dimon sits on the board of the New York Fed. We've talked about it before, long before Whalegate came along. Well, now, hey, look, Bernie Sanders, Barbara Boxer, two senators are introducing a bill targeting Federal Reserve conflicts. Take a listen.
In other words, the people, quote unquote, regulating the banks are the exact same people who are being regulated. If this is not a clear example of the fox guarding the henhouse, I don't know what is.
So they're trying to do something about it, presumably with this bill. Where it goes, we don't know. But we wanted to point out a couple of the other Fed conflicts because Jamie Dimon's been the most prominent, but CEO of GE, Jeff Immelt, he was on the board of the New York Fed the same time the Fed authorized an emergency loan of $16 billion to GE. And in 2008, the chairman of the New York Fed sat on the board of directors for Goldman Sachs when the bank applied and was approved to become a bank holding company, allowing Goldman to receive billions in Federal Reserve loans. Also, the GAO found that at least 18 current and former Fed board members were affiliated with the banks and companies that received emergency loans from the Fed. So do you think this bill's going to go anywhere? Because there are a lot of vested interests that will not want it to.
It's a small, I applaud Bernie Sanders for trying it, but the entire, Bernie Sanders wants to take the Federal Reserve and stick it in Treasury. All right, I think you just get rid of it altogether.
Well, yeah,
right?
because then you have the same conflicts. I mean, come on.
Well, the Fed
is supposed to be
that.
Private and it's run by the banks, but if it's run by the U.S. government, that's not any better. They're doing the bidding of the banks.
if you look at its structure, it's fascist. Okay, it's a public-private enterprise.
That's true.
So, it's got shareholders, but they can't sell the shares. You just need to get rid of it completely. The fact that I applaud Bernie Sanders for trying this little thing here and there, but I wouldn't even concern myself with getting Jamie off of it because that's challenging. That's part of the deal. Either you have a Fed or you don't. Just get rid of the thing entirely. Get rid of it.
Oh, so you're saying as long as we have a Fed, you're going to have Jamie Dimon on the board, and
yeah,
that's just the name of the game. Shannon, you want to add anything?
Well, the senators might want to watch out for their PAC funding and their funding for their reelection campaigns, because obviously a lot of it may come from the banks.
Well, I think if you're exactly, that's why they're not going to get any support from this, in my view, and I'm sure that we'll see that play out. Right, let's move on. As the economy gets worse, it seems businessmen are looking for more ways to keep or secure business through bribes. Look at this.
One Want to know what the business world thinks of you? We think 100 years ago you were living out here in tents in the desert chopping each other's heads off, and that's exactly where you're going to be in another 100. So yes, on behalf of my firm, I accept your money.
It's just business as usual. Maybe it is. Ernst & Young found in its annual global fraud survey that 15% of top execs at leading firms said they would be willing to pay cash to secure business. That's up 9% from 2010. So does this show that crony capitalism is increasingly paying off?
This is the stupidest thing in the world. You want to know why? This is like those articles that inform us that commissioned a study, all this money was spent, and yes, fried chicken is bad for you net. Well, obviously, all this is happening. I mean, we know the bribes are part of business. It goes on. Why did I need someone to tell me this? Yes. I mean, what is Washington?
But the
this city has so much money
show that it's increasingly paying off and that this is a better way to do business for everybody, and the way that we talk about on this show a lot.
Well, yeah. Why is Washington? When I came to Washington, what I was amazed is the amount of money that circulates here and how insulated. It's a bubble.
It is a bubble.
People have lots of cash to spend here. How do they get it? They're supposed to be public servants.
Good point.
Because they're bribing.
Let's move on. We really want to get to this story because we've heard all the Facebook reports. Congressional committees are looking into the IPO. Shareholders are suing. The underwriter, Morgan Stanley, has been subpoenaed. Question is, did big institutional investors get material important information about Facebook before its IPO that smaller and individual investors didn't? Was it illegal? Did it hurt those individual small retail investors that didn't know that the IPO, that the pricing was all wrong? Well, you know what? I don't know what's going to happen, but this all could have been avoided if these retail investors watched CapitalAccount in the beginning of May. Reggie Middleton laid it out very plainly.
You take a good story stock, you give it to a very, very good salesperson, and what do you have? You create froth, okay? Now, froth and investment potential are not necessarily the same thing. No matter what metric you use, price to sales, price to earnings, enterprise value, cash flow, Facebook is grossly overvalued at what the underwriters are trying to push it at.
So when you have plenty of people crunching the numbers, coming out saying things like that in very public ways, there's no case for these small investors. Just don't follow the herd. Do some research.
They should be reading Boom Bust blog and not listening to their broker at Merrill Lynch. Okay, who's selling down the river.
Selling the stock.
They should stop being suckers. But that's why we have evolution.
And that's why we have no more time. Thanks for watching the show. Be sure to come back tomorrow. And in the meantime, you can follow me on Twitter at Lauren Lister. Give us feedback at youtube.com/CapitalAccount, and have a great night.